Hi, this is Stephen again, and I'm here to show you some tips and techniques for Sketchbook Pro. If you've never used Sketchbook Pro, it's a pretty cool, clean looking interface. It's from Autodesk and it is provided for students for free, and I believe there is also a free version if you're not a student, so you can check that out at the Sketchbook Pro website. But this is the new 2021 version of Sketchbook Pro now. It's similar to previous versions, but there have been some enhancements to it. The first thing you'll notice, it's a very clean looking interface, some very simple tools. You've got layers. Sometimes these panels are hidden, but they all can be pulled up by going to the window menu and selecting them. So I could turn on and off the layer editor if I want. This is the brush tools, so I can bring up the brush palette. It also has a pretty extensive brush library, a lot of different brushes you can actually download and install and use. So it's got quite a variety of different drawing tools, and it's really just based on drawing. So in today's session, I'm just going to talk about kind of doing thumbnails for storyboards using Sketchbook Pro, which is a really cool, nice way to work. And specifically, since I'm creating thumbnails for storyboards, it's very quick and easy to kind of generate them and kind of make this palette the way that I want it to look. A few things about thumbnails in general. The first thing is, since these are going to be thumbnails, I'm actually going to make a couple panels. I don't worry about having a template of sorts. I know a lot of people are interested in having a storyboard template. They really don't need to be that extensive, especially for thumbnails. You don't need to necessarily worry about having a template just to kind of generate a bunch of thumbnails, and I'll show you a quick way to do that in Sketchbook Pro. There are ways that you can get that, but it's pretty easy to just set it up. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is changing the image size. So a couple reasons why is, one, I want this to be 1920 by 1080 just for my own purposes. I want it to be that size. So right now it generates the size of this palette of my canvas here based on the size of my monitor. So I can change this though, and a couple things. You can change the document size. So these pixel dimensions will be adjusted by the document size. So I'm going to change the document size. The first thing, I don't need this to be printed, so I'm going to put it at 72 dpi. And I'm going to change this to pixels, and I'm going to type in 1920. And you'll notice that the height adjusts accordingly, but it's because this key proportions is on. So I'm going to change that to 1920 by 1080. If I don't turn off that key proportions, if I change this to 1080, it's going to adjust the width. So I want it to be exactly at 1920 by 1080. That is the high definition standard for the larger high definition televisions, the HD 1920, or it's actually a 1080p. So I'm just going to kind of stick with that because I tend to create a lot of imagery that's used on a screen like that. So with that done, once I change the image size, so if I ever printed this out or displayed it somewhere, it'd actually display on a television at 1920 by 1080 and 72 dpi. That's standard. So the first thing I'm going to show is, like, I'm going to create little panels. So what I do first is I'm just going to fill this with a color. I'm just filling it with black. And then I'm going to choose this tool, which is called Transform. By the way, if these panels aren't up, by the way, you can go over here, which is called the Lagoon, and it's set to Lagoon left. If I choose Lagoon right, it's going to bring it up over here, and I can bring it back to the left by doing this. The Lagoon gives you quick access to, say, the tools. So they're also appear in the toolbar, the brushes, the standard brushes that are in this panel, colors, different selection methods, and sort of how I'm going to save and export and that sort of thing. And then I'll talk about all these other panels when we kind of get to them. But again, if these are not up, you can go to Window, and I can turn on the Lagoon and the toolbar and the color puck and the brush puck, and I'll talk about those. These are the pucks that I'll talk about. Anyway, once I've got this filled in and I can choose this icon, which is Transform. And this gives me a distortion of that, but I just want the scale transform. And then I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and I'm dragging from this upper corner, and it's going to give me the same ratio as 1920 by 1080, which is kind of the idea here is I'm making thumbnails that are the same size as the overall screen. So I want it to be 1920 by 1080, and I can kind of scale it up a little bit. And I'm going to go across this way with it and then down. So we'll talk about that, and I can duplicate this, which is kind of cool. So I'm also going to press the spacebar, and in the middle of this little puck right here, I can zoom in if I want, or zoom out. On the edges of that, I can move it. So it just gives me a little hand cursor to move the palette around. So if I want, I can zoom in and I can get closer to this. And then what I'm going to do once I have this sort of arranged, I can always change this. This is just so I can do some thumbnails. I'm going to choose the selection tools, and then I'm going to just choose this rectangular selection, and I'm just going to draw a little rectangle inside of my, this little rectangle that I've already drawn out. And I'm just going to press delete. And there I have a frame, which is pretty simple and easy to do. I'm going to press Command D. I'm on a Mac, but you can hold down Control D and you can get rid of that selection, right? That just gets rid of it. So now I have it over in the layers panel. So another one thing I want to do, because I'm going to have multiple panels, I want to kind of group them. I want to make them, sort of layer groups. And what you could do is create a little folder. And in that folder, I can just press down. I'm actually using a Cintiq display. So, but if you're using a tablet, it's really nice to use a pen tablet. But even with a mouse, you can kind of do this. I'm just kind of clicking down on top of that folder that I just created. And I can do a bunch of these different actions with it, right? One is add a layer. I can delete a layer group. I can rename the group, which is really what I'm going to do. Ungroup, merge, lock, hide, duplicate, right? But I want to rename it. And I'm going to call this panel 1. And in group 1, I'm actually just going to call it panel 1 and click OK. So now I've created a group, and I can lock that group. I can move the group if I wanted to. I can hide the group if I wanted to. Right now it doesn't have anything, but I'm going to drag this layer 1. I'm going to go over to this move, and I'm going to move it. It's a reorder, so I can just move it right up into the panel 1. And if I click that little icon for the folder, it expands or collapses it, right? So it expands it to show what's in it and collapses it if I just want to see that group. So then in this layer, this is my panel, this is my frame that I'm going to draw my storyboard in. I'm going to lock that so I don't actually paint on that layer. I want to keep that just as a frame. And then I'm going to create another layer. And I just click the plus sign and it creates another layer. And that layer now is something that I'm going to draw in. And this is where I'm going to create my storyboard thumbnails. Now, by no means am I an expert storyboard artist, but I do a lot of storyboarding for my own stories and my own purposes. So I just use very basic shapes. And if you're trying to be a storyboard artist, that's great, and learn anatomy and kind of go through all this. But for me, for my purposes, I'm just looking at a basic composition. And generally when I see thumbnails from other storyboard artists, they're just very basic and very quick. So I'm going to show that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the pencil, right? And if I just draw with the pencil, you're going to see that I'm just kind of drawing with a basic shape, right? And I can, if I want, I can, give this is like the character's head, and this is his nose line and eye line. And I can, make little shoulders for this character, right? So I'm kind of making him at a bit of an angle here and looking up, right? And you can make this detailed as you want, but I'm just roughing out, giving my storyboard just a starting point, right? It's just thumbnails. Now, if the pen settings, like I've got it set where the opacity is kind of down a little bit, you can always change these opacity settings. So you get these two pucks. This puck right here is the color. And if I click this, I can change the color a little bit. And I'm going to change it to kind of a blue color. And I can move it around and reposition it. But you'll also see it has a little eyedropper, which I can pick up colors. So I can pick up that color if I want. But I'm going to click that, and I'm going to make it kind of a bluish color, right? So, and then you'll quite often see this in a lot of storyboards where somebody's going over it in blue to get the basic shape, right? And then they go back to black and make it less opaque. So this puck right here is the opacity and size. So if I go up and down its opacity, so I can go to 100% opacity and draw over that, and I'm actually getting, a harder line with that pencil. And if I chose a different brush, I can actually choose a, more technical brush and get a harder line if I wanted to, right? And then if I want, I can even add another layer on top of that. If I want to do like a polishing layer, I can add another layer on top of that and then use that as sort of the polishing layer. I could just kind of go around and make sure that that's kind of the general shape that I want, and then I can hide that. Not my perfect work, but that kind of shows you the idea behind that. So I'm actually going to delete this layer So I go up to here and go to delete, right? Because I'm just going to rough this out really quickly, give my eye line here. But again, this is color. So I can choose, say, a blue color if I want, which is very typical. I can up and down in this puck is the opacity, and left to right is the brush size. So I can go to make it a higher brush size, and you can actually see the brush size getting bigger. So then if I want, a more rough look to it, right? I try to stay a fairly decent size, but so I'm going to do this to make it smaller, right? And then I'm going to just delete that, or I'm going to erase that. So since I'm using a Cintiq display, I can just go over this with the pencil, or reverse the pen and use the eraser on the other side to erase it. If you have a mouse, you can use a mouse. You just have to switch to the eraser and do that way. So, but anyway, I'm gonna draw another character right here. Give an idea of, sort of, this is another character that this character is talking to, right? And then this is the back of their head or whatever. So I can make it better if I want, but these are just thumbnails to get an idea. So this would be kind of a typical over-the-shoulder shot. It's kind of close, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my second panel. So I'm not going to spend too much time, especially for thumbnails. I'm not going to spend too much time on each panel. I'm just kind of getting an idea of what I want this scene to look like. So then I can actually take this entire panel set and I can duplicate it. So I can go, again, there's rename, there's ungroup, there's merge down, there's lock, there's hide, there's duplicate. So I can duplicate the entire group. And here I have panel 1, and then I'm going to go here and I'm going to click on it. I'm just clicking and holding, and I'm going to go to rename. And then I'm going to change that to panel 2. And click OK. And now I can get rid of this entire layer, but what I want to do is I want to move this entire thing. So I'm going to click this, this is quick transform tools. So it's going to give me this little puck, and all I have to do is click here and move it over, right? And then I'm going to have my second panel. Now, if I want, I can just delete the layer, or I can just take some of the selection tools, select across it, and then just delete it, right? And then Command or Control D to get rid of it. And then I can start my next drawing in that layer, right? So these layer panels, the groups that I put little folders for are all, self-contained. So if I don't like what I'm seeing, I can get rid of it or move it or change it, right? So now I'm going to start my second one. And technically, usually you want to start a scene with an establishing shot. And I'm going to show you really quickly what I mean by that. If you've never seen this before or never known what an establishing shot is, I'm going to show you a little example. This is from a movie called Land of the Lost. In this one particular scene, I like this scene because it's kind of a nice setup. It's kind of a nice setup in the way that shots are progressed, especially in a dialogue shot. So the very first shot of this scene, it's an establishing shot. You kind of establish where they're at in this location. You see them from far away. You get an idea of what the surroundings look like. And if you look at this, like, they've really designed this to stand out the characters. Like, they're center, they're highlighted. You can see that this light is going around here. So you also see, you see the environment here, but it really highlights these characters. It really brings them into focus. So this is what we consider an establishing shot. And then it gets into the characters, right? You see the characters a little more close up. It's more of what we call a medium shot. And then here's Will Ferrell, and this is sort of an over-the-shoulder shot of sorts. Like, you see this character, and you get to see him in reference, right? If you just saw Will Ferrell's character and not this other character, they might be either in totally different places or might be, standing much further apart. So they try to establish where they are in relationship to one another. Right. And then in this third shot, it's just him looking pretty much right at the camera, sort of looking at the camera's shoulder. Really don't want the actors looking straight into a camera. And then in this next shot, you actually see the reverse, what they call a reaction shot between the characters. So I'm not going to mimic this exactly, but I just wanted to bring this up to show that the first shot of this scene is an establishing shot, and then you get in closer to see the actors, and you can actually see that, it's a medium shot there. It's a little bit more of a medium shot here because you see what they might call a cowboy shot because it's above the knees. And then this one's a little more head and shoulders, and then back to kind of a medium shot of these two characters as they're kind of talking back and forth. And that's the idea. We're going to be kind of doing that. Another thing to kind of bring up with this, it's a couple things about line of action. It's not about teaching a lot of camera movement for this little session, but I want to kind of bring this up is generally you want your cameras to be on this side of this line between the two characters. If they're talking and you set up a camera here, you never want to cross that line. It's called breaking the 180-degree rule, right? So the idea here is this camera, you see this red character here and the blue character here. The red character is always going to own this space, right? Otherwise, it's going to look really awkward. Then on this camera, you see these two characters facing one another, and the one in red is, again, still on the left-hand side. And then the blue character is on the right. And this camera right here, still the red character is on the left, the blue character is on the right. If the camera crosses that line, it cuts. So if you saw this shot, and then this shot, and then this shot, it would all make sense because the red character is always on the left-hand side of the screen, the blue character is always on the right. On this one, it switches. If the camera switches to this side and then cuts, so let's say you're showing this and then this, you're going to think, even though this character is red, if the character wasn't red, you wouldn't really know. You would think this is the blue character, right? And that's kind of the idea here, is you don't want it to switch sides because it's going to create a discontinuity in the viewer. So we want to avoid that. So every time we establish a character, if it's on the left, and I can look back at the previous example of the Land of the Lost examples, that characters were always on the same side of this line, right? The camera will never break that line unless it moves across that line or character moves across that line, right? So that'll reestablish the line. So if this character moved over here, then this would work because then that line moved, right? It's always established between the two characters. So if this character moves over here, then this camera would make sense. But right as it is, this character, this red character, would be on the right and the blue character would be on the left. Anyway, something to pay attention to when you're coming up with storyboards that you want to kind of avoid. So whatever this character is going to be, it's always going to be on the left unless it moves, right? So I'm going to create sort of an establishing shot for my scene here. So I'm just going to go back to my pencil and I'm going to, draw just a quick. It doesn't matter if you draw little stick figures. It's quite okay when you're doing, if you want, you can draw, like sometimes I draw little triangles for, their body and then their arms. But it's up to you how you want to kind of create that. And I'm going to, let's say that I've got sort of a little scene here. And then let's say I have a tree. Right, and I don't want to get too carried away with how everything looks. Let's say I have some brush or something over here, and then I've got another character that's standing right here as well, right? And then that's my establishing shot. Let's say that's my establishing shot. So this character is always going to be this character, right? And if this shot doesn't work, and I'm going to make a little house over here. Or something, a structure of some sort, right? That's my scene. That's my establishing shot. If I don't like it, I can quickly move on, or I can get rid of it, or I fix something, but don't spend too much time on each panel. So again, I'm going to hold down the space bar and move this over a little bit. I like to kind of keep it in my view while I'm moving on to the next panel. And again, I'm going to duplicate this layer group, right? So I can go to duplicate and then collapse this panel 2 and go to panel 1. Go to this new duplicated one and rename it. And then I'm going to rename it panel 3. Right? And then I'm going to move it over. So I can hold down this. Sorry, wrong one. Let's move that like this. And I ended up drawing on that, which is okay because then I can select that one. I can actually hide these other panels. And I can select across this, and I can just press delete, and then Command or Control D, and then I can focus on that panel if I want. I can clean that panel out, right? Like I said before, I can delete that, and then I can draw a new panel. So I'm going to show these again. Again, that's the hide button. I can hide those layers, and that's kind of the idea of drawing these in layers and layer group, is that I can hide them really quick. And then I'm going to go, let's say I have a medium shot of this one. Whoop. I have a medium shot of this one character, so I'm going to draw a little bit of his arms I tend to draw the head first just because it orients me, right? And then let's say I have this other character that's over here. It's a little bit bigger because he's in the foreground, right? And again, I'm going to draw the eye line. And I can do that here too. I can go back. Whoop, I want to kind of switch back to that panel and, you know, maybe draw his eye line there, and this character is going to be like that. You know, just to kind of give some sort of direction to the character, some directionality to the character. If I want, I can lock these layers too if I don't want to draw on them. Collapse that, come back up here. Just remember which layer you're drawing on, right? And I'm going to have this character here, you know, and maybe he's gesturing of some sort, you know. Again, I'm not trying to get too detailed with the characters and how I'm drawing them. Right now, it's just thumbnails. So I'm going to kind of stop right there because that gives you enough to kind of start and to draw your own thumbnails. You can use references. References are always kind of a nice thing to kind of look at. Like I can look at the other films or other creative works, other visual works that I can sort of mimic. I tend to not put them in here and trace over the top of them. I guess to a certain degree you could, as long as you're not tracing them completely, because then it starts to look like you're just kind of ripping off somebody else's work, right? Which you don't want to do, right? Come up with your own. I mean, there's only so many compositions you can really come up with, but you can use them as a guide. Like I tend to look at a lot of films and kind of, if I like a shot, I can kind of mimic it or not necessarily duplicate it, but kind of come up with my own take on that particular shot or that kind of particular angle, right? And only put so many details in here that are important for the story. Like if this tree over here was important or significant for the story, I'd want to kind of draw it in, or that structure, which would be behind this character. But the other thing that you could do is if this panel was moving into the next one, I could actually draw an arrow. So like, let's say the camera had some movement to it. I could actually draw an arrow and kind of indicate that this camera is moving to the next panel. And then I can, you know, duplicate that panel again. But I can, you know, get that, just really kind of quickly sketch that in, realize that the camera is moving, right? So I can also indicate that by other arrows or whatever, or indicate character movement by doing arrows or something. And just to give myself an idea of when I go back to fill in these storyboards, then I can get a little more detailed and be a little more precise and clean them up a little bit so it makes a little more sense. But right now, the whole idea is just to kind of communicate what's going on in composition. A couple things that'll also help you out is always make sure that you save your work. So I can go to Save As, and the default file format for this is a TIFF. There's no native file format for a Sketchbook Pro, but you can also save it as an Adobe Photoshop PSD, and that'll keep all the layers. It'll preserve all the layers. So I can just call this my storyboard example. And then I'm just saving it to pictures, or I can, you know, put it on the desktop or whatever. Currently, I'm just going to save it in my pictures folder and then just click save. By the way, if you press tab, it cleans up your interface. Right? You can actually, just free from distractions, you can just sort of draw and then press tab and bring up everything again. But also down here, you have a little part of the lagoon. We'll move to the next image if I have another one saved. Go to new, make a new document, save, open. So I can just go to there and save, where I can you know, obviously use shortcut keys, Command S or Control S to save it. And so that'll help you out, and that'll get you going with the Sketchbook Pro and thumbnailing storyboards.